The wind off the Baltic Sea was sharp, biting through the early morning mist. It was barely 8 a.m., but already the sun began to fight through the haze, turning the coastal fog into a hazy light that burned the eyes. The compound was alive with the usual rhythm: boots on gravel, the sharpness of shouted commands, the metallic clink of steel against steel. But this wasn't a typical day. Today was the day of the readiness evaluation, an important quarterly exercise where the entire Wojsko Polski's Special Forces unit, including the elite GROM, would participate in a high-stakes training session. This time, though, there was something more than just physical endurance on the line. There would be a demonstration of close-quarters combat, the kind rarely witnessed by outsiders, and one unlikely participant would be in the center of it all. Petty Officer Elena Wojcik, a 28-year-old field medic who had recently been reassigned to the unit from the Combat Medical Support Division. Elena was average in stature, her dark brown hair tied into a tight braid under her military cap. Her face, while not unfriendly, lacked the kind of features that might attract attention in a crowd. But if you looked closely, you might notice the faint insignia of her previous service in the Marine Corps on the sleeve of her fatigues. A detail that spoke volumes about her experience, her resilience. 3 deployments as a combat medic, and another embedded with a reconnaissance team on secretive operations that didn't appear in any public records. Yet here, at the center of the training compound, she was far from the attention she had commanded in her past roles. Today, she was to demonstrate defensive hand-to-hand techniques under pressure, a task meant to show the GROM operators how a non-combatant would survive an ambush while treating the wounded. She wasn't there to impress anyone. Elena didn't need to prove herself. She knew her place, and more importantly, she knew her limits. She had been tasked with showing them something far more difficult: restraint. As she moved to the center of the training ring, the eyes of over 200 soldiers turned toward her, each one evaluating, measuring. The murmurs started low, but they were unmistakable. "Is that the medic?" someone whispered. "She doesn't look like she's seen combat," another muttered. Elena heard them all. She'd always heard the whispers, but she knew better than to engage with them. Instead, she stood in the center of the ring, adjusting her gloves, her stance calm but alert. She wasn't here for the theatrics. Elena was here to show them what true control looked like when the stakes were life or death. As Chief Instructor Dariusz Kowalski introduced her, the murmurs grew louder, but Elena didn't flinch. She simply looked ahead, prepared to do her job. The GROM soldiers, among the toughest in Poland, weren't known for showing respect easily. But as Elena stepped forward, they would learn to respect something far more formidable than strength: precision. Today's demonstration would be nothing like they had seen before. This would be a lesson in survival, taught not with brute force, but with discipline and skill. Elena didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to engage in banter. She simply spoke, her voice steady. "I'm not here to show you how strong I am," she said. "I'm here to show you how to stay alive when you're the only one standing between a wounded comrade and an incoming threat." As her words were simple, but they cut through the tension in the air. The soldiers, once eager to see a show, now leaned forward, paying attention. Some had started to rethink their assumptions about the medic they had expected to be no more than a formality. But there were still those like Senior Operator Maciej Ślusarczyk and the rookie Kacper Kowal, whose arrogance hadn't been shaken. They stood together near the front of the crowd, their arms crossed, sneering. Maciej, with his muscular frame and tattoos that marked every battle he'd survived, was the kind of man who believed in strength above all. Kacper, young and brash, followed his mentor's every move, his swagger as loud as his smirk. "You believe this?" Kacper muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear. "She's going to teach us how to not die?" Maciej chuckled darkly, his voice carrying across the group. "It's medic dance," he said. "I bet they want us to cheer when she spins." Some of the others laughed too, but not all of them. Elena didn't react. She didn't need to. The demonstration began, and it wasn't long before Elena proved that what they had assumed would be an easy lesson was something far more complex. Her first demonstration was precise, flawless. The training partner, a GROM soldier, played the role of a downed operative. As he simulated a wound, Elena moved fluidly, demonstrating techniques to stabilize the injury while defending against an ambush. It was subtle, controlled, nothing theatrical, just pure technique. But the more seasoned GROM soldiers, those who had seen real combat, were starting to shift in their seats, their expressions changing. No one had expected this. Elena moved as if she were part of the very fabric of the battlefield, not someone who had simply read about it in a manual. As the demonstration continued, however, it was clear that there were those who were not so impressed by her control. Maciej and Kacper were among them, still making loud comments about the ballet of it all, mocking her technique. But Elena didn't respond. She simply moved, each time more decisively, more precisely. And as she executed each move, more and more GROM soldiers began to realize the quiet truth that Elena wasn't just performing a drill. She was teaching them something that couldn't be measured by physical strength alone. She was teaching them the art of survival. As the demonstration progressed, Elena's presence in the center of the ring became undeniable. She wasn't here to entertain. She was here to prove something far more important. As Elena continued her demonstration, a subtle shift in the crowd was undeniable. The mockery that had initially filled the air was slowly being replaced with a sense of focused curiosity. The soldiers who had been so eager to dismiss her were now leaning forward, their eyes narrowing, calculating. Elena's every move seemed deliberate, as if each gesture was part of a much larger plan. She wasn't simply going through the motions. She was creating a lesson in survival that transcended the usual tactics. Her second volunteer, a seasoned GROM operator, stepped into the ring with the kind of cocky confidence that only years of experience could bring. He had been briefed to simulate a surprise attack from behind, an ambush scenario that could happen during an extraction. Elena's movements were swift, her focus unyielding. She ducked beneath his arms and twisted his body, redirecting his momentum and using his own weight against him to take him to the ground. There was no grand flourish, no dramatic flips, just clean, efficient execution. She pinned him in place, her hand firm but controlled on his wrist, ensuring he couldn't escape. The crowd watched in silence, save for the occasional gasp or murmur of surprise. But it wasn't just the younger GROM operators who were impressed. Even some of the older, more experienced men exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from skepticism to something that could almost be called respect. But not everyone was convinced. Maciej and Kacper, still standing at the front of the circle, hadn't let go of their cynicism. "All that just to put him on the ground?" Kacper whispered to Maciej. "Let's see her do that with someone who isn't playing along." Maciej's smile didn't waver. He still thought of Elena as a novelty, a woman who didn't belong in this kind of environment. "We'll see," he muttered. But Elena was already resetting the demonstration. She had heard their whispers, but she wasn't about to waste her time on petty comments. She was here to show them something far more important. Elena's next volunteer was a larger man, another GROM operator who had been given the task of simulating an attack from the front. This time the stakes were higher. As the man lunged toward her, Elena's body shifted with smooth precision, dropping her weight to redirect his force and throw him off balance. His initial strike was strong, but she used it against him, twisting his arm behind his back and forcing him to the ground. Again, no theatrics, no dramatic gestures, just solid, precise technique. This time, there was no laughter, no snide comments. The mood in the crowd had shifted. Some of the men, like senior operator Tomasz Nowak, were nodding, their expressions hard to read but clearly impressed. Others, like Maciej and Kacper, were becoming uncomfortable. They were starting to realize that Elena wasn't just playing a part. She wasn't there to perform for them. She was there to teach them, and there was something about her composure that was starting to get under their skin. "She's not doing anything special," Kacper muttered, trying to convince himself. "She just got lucky with that one." But even Maciej wasn't so sure anymore. He watched Elena reset again, her body language still calm, still focused, as if this were all just another day at the office. The chief instructor, Dariusz Kowalski, was observing closely. He could see the tension in the air, the shift in dynamics. He'd been around long enough to know when a moment was about to change everything, and this was one of those moments. Elena's next move would be a test for everyone, not just the men watching her, but for herself as well. She had proved the basics, but now it was time to show them what it meant to be under real pressure. "Last scenario," she announced quietly, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "This one will simulate a dual-threat scenario. 2 attackers, both armed. It's different from the last 2 demonstrations. We'll see how well we can adapt under real combat conditions." The challenge had been laid out, and Elena stood at the center of the ring, ready. She didn't wait for any further commentary. She didn't need to. There was a shift in the air, a tension that now seemed to hold the crowd in place. They were all waiting for something. Some of the men, like Tomasz, knew what was coming. They had seen this kind of precision before, in combat zones, in moments when survival wasn't just a goal, it was the only option. But for others, like Maciej and Kacper, this was about to become more than they had bargained for. 2 attackers, 1 medic, Maciej muttered under his breath. He was still sizing her up, still thinking there was no way she could handle it. But Elena didn't flinch. She simply nodded to her volunteers, 2 men who stepped forward with the kind of determination that only GROM operators could muster. There was no formal signal. The first move came fast, brutal. Marcus Hale, the senior operator, lunged at her from the right side, his movements quick and forceful. Kacper followed up from the left, aiming for her exposed side. But Elena was ready. Her posture didn't change. She shifted her weight and pivoted, using her attacker's momentum against them. The first strike came from Marcus, an attempt to overpower her with raw force. But Elena wasn't there to match him. She stepped aside, her body rotating with controlled precision. Her arm moved quickly, capturing his wrist and locking it into an angle that made his forward momentum useless. With one quick move, she brought him down to the ground. But there was no time to breathe. Kacper was already closing in from behind, his movements fast, aggressive. Elena's response was instinctual. She dropped her center of gravity, spun, and caught him by the shoulder, twisting him to the ground in a motion so fluid it was almost hard to follow. In less than 3 seconds, both attackers were on the ground, their movements frozen, their bodies pinned. Elena stood over them, her breathing steady, her eyes cold. She had won. But there were no cheers, no applause, just silence. The crowd stood in stunned disbelief. They had expected something flashy, something for them to dismiss. Instead, they had witnessed a lesson in survival, a lesson in control and restraint. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. It was broken only when one of the senior operators, Tomasz Nowak, spoke up. "That was real," he muttered, his voice low, but filled with something Elena hadn't heard from the men around her before. Respect. The silence in the ring lingered, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that follows an undeniable truth, the kind of silence that speaks volumes without a single word being uttered. Elena stood motionless in the center, watching as the 2 men she had just neutralized slowly rose to their feet. They weren't smiling, they weren't making excuses. There was only the grim acceptance of defeat. No one had expected her to move with such speed, precision, and control. But in that moment, everyone present knew exactly what had just transpired. The mockery from earlier had disappeared completely. In its place was something far more powerful: respect. Elena didn't gloat. She didn't make a grand gesture. She simply stepped back, her movements deliberate, measured. As she stood there, the weight of the situation began to settle into the minds of the men around her. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, others took a deep breath, but all of them were thinking the same thing. They had underestimated her. "Let's reset," Chief Kowalski said, breaking the stillness. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. The trainees, who had been so eager to dismiss Elena earlier, now stood in a line of quiet observation. The casual joking had disappeared. The atmosphere had shifted from one of cynical amusement to one of nervous tension. Maciej and Caxper exchanged glances, neither of them willing to admit what had just happened. They still couldn't quite believe it. To them, Elena's success felt like a fluke, an anomaly that could be explained away by luck or circumstance. But there was no denying what they had just witnessed. Elena had moved with the kind of efficiency that only comes from years of experience, from being tested in the most brutal environments, and there was no getting around the fact that both of them had been taken down in less than 7 seconds. It wasn't luck, it wasn't a fluke, it was skill. Elena glanced toward Chief Kowalski, who nodded to her once as if acknowledging her execution of the demonstration. It wasn't a look of pride, but of acknowledgment. This was a man who had seen it all, the finest soldiers, the hardest fighters. And even he was impressed by the clarity with which Elena had handled the situation. He gestured for the next scenario to begin, but this time the group didn't move with the same carefree attitude they had before. There was a palpable sense of seriousness in the air now. Maciej and Caxper didn't step forward, neither did anyone else from the front row. Instead, some of the more seasoned veterans, men who had seen real combat, moved to the front, positioning themselves in the ring to test her again. They weren't looking for a show. They weren't looking for an easy win. They were looking for something real. And Elena, without a word, moved into position, ready to show them exactly what real meant. This time it was 2 attackers again, but with a twist. The GROM operators would be allowed to attack in tandem without any predefined moves. There would be no choreography, no training speed allowed. This would be as close to a real combat situation as anyone could get, without risking life or limb. As the attackers approached, Elena didn't waste a single moment. The first operator lunged, trying to overpower her with sheer size and force. Elena didn't try to match him. She didn't resist his momentum. She let it carry him forward, twisting her body at just the right angle to send him crashing to the ground. The second attacker, a lanky man with lightning-fast reflexes, tried to flank her from behind. Elena didn't panic. She dropped to one knee, grabbing his arm and twisting his body with expert precision. Within seconds, both attackers were on the ground, their attempts thwarted. The speed, the efficiency, there was no time to react. And just like that, the lesson had been learned. The senior operators, once so skeptical of Elena, were now nodding to each other in approval. Even Maciej and Caxper, despite their best efforts to remain stoic, were finally beginning to understand. It wasn't about strength. It wasn't about size. It was about knowing your own body, knowing how to use an opponent's momentum to your advantage, and knowing when to strike and when to retreat. Elena didn't linger. She didn't look around for approval. She simply reset, stepping back and watching as her attackers got to their feet. "You did well," Tomasz Nowak said quietly, his voice almost a whisper as he approached. There was no sarcasm, no mockery, just a simple statement of fact. That was real. Elena nodded, but didn't respond. She wasn't there for validation. She was there to do her job. Chief Kowalski called for the next exercise, but it was clear that something had shifted in the group. The arrogance that had once filled the air had dissipated, replaced by a sober acknowledgement of what had just occurred. The training was still intense, but now it was different. The GROM operators weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were paying attention, really paying attention. And as the exercise continued, there was a subtle shift in how they moved around Elena. No longer was she the medic, the outsider who didn't belong. She was just another member of the team, someone who had proven her worth in the most unforgiving way possible. For the rest of the session, there were no more whispers, no more smirks, no more assumptions. Elena had shown them exactly what it meant to be a true operator, and in doing so, she had earned their respect. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't grand, but it was there, and that, Elena knew, was all she needed. The rest of the training day moved quickly, but the air was thick with the quiet realization that Elena had earned something that couldn't be measured in ranks or titles. By the time the evaluation was over, the 282 men who had witnessed her demonstration were no longer dismissing her as a mere medic. Elena had transformed from the outsider into someone they could no longer overlook. As the men packed up their gear and began to leave the training grounds, the conversation shifted. What had started as mockery had turned into quiet discussions about technique, about survival, and about the very real lesson Elena had taught them. Monsieur and Katzper were silent now. They didn't joke with each other as they normally didn't laugh at the absurdity of the day. Instead, they walked together, their heads down, reflecting on the reality of what had just happened. Even as they left the grounds, the weight of the lesson was still pressing on them. The rest of the GROM operators, the senior veterans, and even the younger trainees were beginning to speak in hushed tones about Elena's skills, her control, her ability to use pressure without being overrun. Chief Kowalski had watched the transformation, and though his face remained as stoic as always, there was a moment when his eyes met Elena's. It was a silent acknowledgment of what had been accomplished. The day's training had been difficult, intense, and mentally draining, but it had also been a turning point. Elena Wojcik had shown that even the most underestimated person could hold their ground when faced with real pressure. As she walked away from the compound, the sun beginning to set over the horizon, Elena felt a strange calm settle over her. The fight, the resistance, the proving, it was all over. But that wasn't the end of it. She knew this would follow her into the future. The next day, a different kind of battle would begin. That evening, Elena stood alone in her quarters, preparing for the debriefing that would take place the following morning. She had already completed the standard post-training reports, detailing the exercise and the participants' performance, but she knew that wasn't what this debriefing would be about. The question that hung in the air was simple. Had she crossed a line? Had she overstepped the boundaries of the demonstration? She wasn't worried about her actions. She had acted in self-defense, and the result had been the necessary response to aggression. But she knew the military was not a place where logic and fairness always prevailed. There would be politics to navigate, and there would be those who felt uncomfortable with what had unfolded. Elena was prepared for that. She had known the cost of this job long before she had been assigned to the GROM unit. She had known the sacrifice, the quiet expectations, the unspoken rules that governed everything from training exercises to real combat. She wasn't naive. The debriefing the next day was not as straightforward as Elena had hoped. She sat in front of a small panel, including Chief Kowalski, an investigating officer, and a legal representative from Naval Special Warfare Command. There was no animosity in the room, just the unspoken tension of a procedure that had to be followed. They began with a simple question, one that Elena had anticipated. Petty Officer Wojcik, the legal officer began, at what point did you determine the situation was no longer a controlled demonstration? Elena didn't hesitate. The moment they struck me with real intent, she replied, her voice steady and calm. I was off balance, and there was no pre-contact indicator. That moved it out of drill protocol and into survival training. The officer typed the answer into her laptop, looking up only once to gauge Elena's reaction. Did you issue a verbal warning? The officer continued. Yes. Elena replied. "I said you've crossed into live response." The investigation officer nodded, then asked, "Was this level of force necessary?" Elena's response was direct. "If I had hesitated, I would have been overrun. The injuries were caused by their forward momentum against applied rotational locks and stabilization failures. I didn't generate force. I used theirs." The room was quiet as the officers reviewed their notes. The tension was palpable, but Elena remained still, unflinching. This was the part of the job she had always known she would have to face: review, scrutiny, and the weight of consequence. "We've reviewed footage from security cameras, and the strikes are clear," the legal officer said, tapping a few keys. "We will proceed with witness testimony. Over 30 GROM operators gave their accounts, and their testimonies are consistent." Elena listened carefully, her posture never shifting. She knew what the men had said, what they had seen. They had all watched it unfold in real time, and their reports confirmed what she had already said. It had been an act of self-defense, no more and no less. A few minutes passed as the officers compiled their notes, the weight of the situation settling into the room. Finally, the legal officer spoke again. "Petty Officer Wojcik, your actions were within the bounds of tactical doctrine. No violation of the UCMJ. No deviation from field medical response guidelines." Elena felt a brief flicker of relief, but it was fleeting. She knew this would not be the end of it. There would be consequences, and they would come in ways she could not predict. The panel stood, and Elena followed suit. As the officers left the room, the investigating officer stopped for a moment and gave her a small, approving nod. "You did well," he said quietly before leaving her alone. Elena didn't smile. She simply nodded back, her mind already shifting to the next task at hand. As the door closed behind her, she exhaled deeply, the tension finally easing from her body. The battle wasn't over. It never would be, but for today she had won. The following days passed quickly, though the atmosphere on the base had subtly shifted. There was a palpable difference in how the soldiers moved around Elena. It wasn't respect born out of courtesy or formality. It was a quiet acknowledgement of her strength, of her ability to perform under the harshest of pressures. Gone were the days of whispered jokes and dismissive glances. Now, when Elena walked into a room, the chatter died down. There were no loud, brash comments. There was only silence, respectful silence. The most significant change, however, was in the behavior of the senior operators. Tomasz Novak, a seasoned veteran who had been observing her during the demonstration, approached her one morning as she was restocking medical supplies. His gait was slow but deliberate, his eyes focused on her as if searching for something. "Petty Officer Wojcik," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of experience. Elena glanced up, offering a nod of acknowledgement. "You've earned their respect," Tomasz said simply. "The younger ones, the new recruits, they're looking at you differently now." Elena didn't respond immediately. She had known that her actions would have consequences, both positive and negative. But this was different. Tomasz wasn't offering praise. He wasn't trying to make her feel comfortable. He was simply stating a fact. The dynamic on base had shifted. "I did what needed to be done," Elena replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the internal conflict that had accompanied her actions. Nothing more, nothing less. Tomasz studied her for a moment, then nodded. "That's the thing," he said, almost to himself. It wasn't just about breaking them down. It was about what came after. Elena didn't need to ask him what he meant. She understood all too well. The aftermath of the demonstration had been about survival, about what came next. The respect she had earned was not something she had sought. It wasn't about proving herself to anyone. It was about doing her job. But the cost of that respect was still unknown. That evening, Elena found herself back in her quarters, preparing for the next day's training exercise. She was calm, methodical, the same way she had been the day before, the day of the demonstration, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the legal debriefing. They had cleared her of any misconduct, but there was still the lingering weight of what had happened. There was always a risk in pushing back against authority, even when the situation called for it. And Elena knew better than anyone that the military was a place where everything, even the smallest mistake, could have far-reaching consequences. Her mind wandered to the other soldiers, the ones who had witnessed her actions. How would they view her now? Would the respect they had for her grow stronger, or would it fade, replaced by a quiet resentment? As the night wore on, Elena's thoughts grew heavier. She had been in situations before where she had been forced to defend herself, where the consequences of inaction had been too great. But this time, it was different. This time, the consequences were about more than just her own survival. They were about the survival of the unit as a whole. The following morning, Elena arrived at the training compound early, as was her habit. The base was still quiet, the sounds of the early morning drills only beginning to pick up. She walked toward the medical supply room, her mind still heavy with thoughts of the debriefing. But as she entered the compound, she was met with an unexpected sight. Senior Operator Maciej Ślusarczyk was waiting near the entrance, his posture stiff, his arms crossed. Elena paused for a moment, unsure of what to expect. Maciej was one of the few men on base who had refused to acknowledge her actions with anything more than sarcastic comments. But now, as she stood before him, there was something different in his demeanor. "Petty Officer Wojcik," Maciej said, his voice low but steady. Elena didn't speak immediately. She had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than words. "I wanted to apologize." Maciej continued, the words clearly uncomfortable for him. "I was wrong about you. What you did wasn't easy, and it wasn't a fluke." Elena didn't respond. She didn't need to. The apology itself, however awkward, was enough. Maciej, for the first time since their initial encounter, looked her in the eye with a kind of acknowledgement that he had never shown before. He wasn't looking for forgiveness. He was simply offering respect in the only way he knew how. "It's not about proving anything," Elena replied finally, her voice calm and even. "It's about doing your job." Maciej nodded slowly, his gaze lingering for a moment longer before he turned to walk away. Elena watched him leave, her mind racing. This was a small victory, one that most people would never understand. But to her, it was enough. It was a sign that the respect she had earned was not fleeting. It wasn't something that could be dismissed with a shrug or a few sarcastic words. It was real. Over the next few weeks, the base continued with its routine drills, live-fire exercises, and tactical simulations. But there was a subtle change in how the soldiers interacted with Elena. They no longer viewed her as an outsider, a medic who didn't belong in the field. She had become one of them, just another member of the team. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. When Elena walked into a room, the conversation shifted. There were no more whispers, no more jokes, just quiet respect. As she moved through the training exercises, she continued to demonstrate her skills, each movement as precise and controlled as the last. But there was something else that had changed within her as well. The weight of what had happened during the demonstration, the broken bones, the shifting dynamics, had settled into her bones. She no longer felt the need to prove herself. She had already done that. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, knowing that the only thing that mattered now was the next mission, the next challenge. And when the day came for the next evaluation, Elena stood ready, not to prove herself, but to continue doing what she had always done, her job. As the soldiers prepared for the new set of drills, Elena stood at the edge of the compound, watching them from a distance. She wasn't looking for approval anymore. She wasn't looking for anyone to validate her actions. She had already earned that. What mattered now was that, in the end, she had proved something more important. She had proven that strength wasn't just about physical power. It was about resilience, precision, and the ability to do what needed to be done when it counted the most. The next mission was already in motion, and Elena would be ready. Weeks passed after the intense training evaluation, and though life on base settled into its usual rhythm, the undercurrent of change remained. Elena's role among the GROM operators was no longer that of a silent observer or a mere medic. She had found her place, earned it the hard way, and her presence was now integral to the unit's operations. In the mornings, she joined the operators for their tactical drills. In the evenings, she could be found in the gym, her focus unwavering as she pushed through physical conditioning exercises alongside men who had once considered her an outsider. It wasn't easy. It never was. The burden of her new status as a peer, a fellow operator, weighed on her in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. While the respect was there, so too was the scrutiny. The GROM men, known for their toughness and relentless pursuit of excellence, still watched her closely, evaluating every move she made, every decision she took. But Elena had grown used to that. She had learned long ago to rise above it, to move through the weight of judgment like a storm that passed, leaving nothing but clarity in its wake. There were moments when she doubted herself, when the pressure of being the only woman among such a hardened group of men felt like too much. Yet, whenever she felt those doubts creeping in, she reminded herself of the lesson she had learned on the training ground that day. Survival wasn't about making others see you as capable. It was about being capable, no matter the circumstances. One afternoon, during a routine extraction drill, Elena found herself paired with Tomasz Novak, a senior operator who had become one of her quietest supporters. The exercise required the GROM team to extract a wounded operator from an urban environment while under simulated sniper fire. Tomasz, always steady under pressure, worked in perfect harmony with Elena as they moved through the drill. His experience showed in the way he scanned the perimeter, constantly aware of their surroundings. Elena, equally focused, handled the medical side, applying improvised bandages and preparing their mock casualty for transport. It was a silent, efficient partnership that required no words. Tomasz had become a mentor of sorts to Elena, offering his wisdom during downtimes without ever being overt about it. He respected her not just for her skill, but for the way she had handled herself in the face of so much pressure. By the end of the exercise, they had completed the extraction flawlessly. When they reported back to the briefing room, Tomasz gave Elena a brief but meaningful look, his way of acknowledging her contribution without the need for formal praise. But the recognition from her peers wasn't without its challenges. On one particularly grueling day, during a night operation simulating a rescue under hostile conditions, a younger operator, Janek Kowalski, seemed to take issue with Elena's approach to the mission. He had been a part of the initial training evaluation where Elena had proven herself, but his ego had clearly been bruised by her success. As they moved through the operation, Janek made a few pointed comments about the way Elena handled the simulated casualty extraction. He was trying to undermine her in front of the others, testing her, perhaps hoping to show that she wasn't as tough as she appeared. Elena, ever composed, ignored his taunts at first. But as they reached a critical point in the operation, where she was forced to make a quick decision, Janek's words hit a nerve. He hesitated when it came time to move the casualty, unsure whether to follow her lead or his own instincts. Elena could see the doubt in his eyes, the hesitation that could cost them valuable time. Without a word, she stepped in, barking a quick order to move. She took control of the situation, not because she wanted to, but because it was necessary. The operation continued without further issue, but Janek's frustration was palpable. Afterward, as the team debriefed, Elena could feel his eyes on her. He wasn't angry, not in the traditional sense, but there was a quiet animosity there, one that he would keep simmering until it reached its boiling point. That night, Elena sat alone in her quarters, the weight of the day's events pressing heavily on her mind. She had expected resistance. She had expected friction, but she hadn't anticipated this. She hadn't expected the kind of silent rivalry that Janek had begun to foster. She knew that in a place like this, where only the strongest survive, there would always be men who felt threatened by someone like her, a woman in a space traditionally dominated by men. She knew, too, that Janek's issue with her was not about her skills, but about his own insecurities. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to become much more complicated. The following week, during a live-fire exercise at a remote training site, Janek's bitterness would finally surface. It happened in the middle of a tactical breach drill. Elena was working alongside him once again, this time in a role that required her to be both medic and tactical support, preparing to move into an urban structure under fire. As the team breached the building, a simulated explosion triggered the start of the exercise and chaos erupted. Elena, as trained, moved swiftly, focusing on her assigned task of stabilizing a wounded operator. But as she made her way toward the injured man, Janek deliberately placed himself in her path. His shoulder brushed against hers, a move that could have been passed off as incidental. But Elena knew better. It was intentional. Janek was testing her, seeing how far he could push her without facing consequences. He was trying to assert dominance, to prove that her place in the unit was still one of vulnerability, one that could be easily disrupted. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't react. Instead, she continued her work with precise efficiency, blocking out his presence entirely. Her focus was on the task at hand, not on the petty games that Janek was playing. The exercise finished without incident, but the tension between them had shifted. It was no longer just about proving herself to the team. Now, Elena found herself in the midst of a personal conflict, one that would test her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer just a medic in a combat unit. She was a woman trying to navigate a system that didn't always make space for her, trying to prove to others, and perhaps to herself, that she could belong in a place where few believed she had a right to be. As Elena returned to her quarters that evening, she was acutely aware of the challenge that lay ahead. She had already faced her own doubts, overcome the scorn of those who underestimated her. But now she was dealing with something far more insidious, the subtle, corrosive influence of resentment, the kind that could fester beneath the surface, threatening to tear the unit apart if left unchecked. Elena knew that the coming days would not be easy, but she was ready. She always had been. The tension between Elena and Janek simmered for days, a quiet storm that neither of them acknowledged directly, but was impossible to ignore. Each time they crossed paths during drills, there was a subtle shift in the air. Janek's glances were colder now, his movements more deliberate, as if he were always testing her, waiting for her to slip. Elena, on the other hand, was more focused than ever. She wasn't going to let him, or anyone else, distract her from her mission. She had a job to do, and no amount of petty rivalry would stop her from doing it. But it wasn't just Janek. There were others, too, who watched her with eyes that measured more than just her skill. Some of the younger operators looked at her with admiration, even awe, while others, like Makie, kept their distance, not yet fully convinced. The older, more seasoned men, however, watched with a quiet understanding. They knew what Elena had proven that day on the training ground, but they also knew that respect in the military was never given freely. It had to be earned over time, with consistency, with performance, and with a willingness to endure whatever challenges came your way. That evening, after a particularly demanding field exercise, Elena found herself alone in the gym, working through a series of strength drills. She didn't need to be in the gym, but it was where she could clear her mind. The physical exertion helped to block out the noise, the lingering tension, and the ever-present undercurrent of doubt that accompanied her every decision. As she worked through the routine, she felt a presence behind her. She didn't turn around immediately, but when she did, she saw Tomasz standing in the doorway, watching her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that suggested he knew exactly what she was going through. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Tomasz said quietly, his voice low but firm. Elena paused, wiping the sweat from her brow. "I'm not pushing hard enough," she replied, her tone flat. "I need to be better." Tomasz didn't respond right away. He stepped into the gym and walked toward her slowly, his eyes scanning her form with a kind of analytical precision. "You've already proven yourself," he said finally. "You've done more than most men ever will, but you're chasing something that's out of reach." Elena met his gaze, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm chasing survival," she replied simply. "Survival of the unit, survival of the mission. That's all that matters." Tomasz nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I understand, but you're not alone in this. Don't forget that." Elena didn't say anything in response. She knew he was right. She had earned the respect of the unit, but that didn't mean she could do everything on her own. She couldn't carry the weight of the entire unit's expectations. She couldn't fight every battle alone. For a moment the two of them stood in silence, the only sound the distant hum of the lights overhead. Then Tomasz spoke again. "You don't have to prove anything to me," he said softly. "And you don't have to prove anything to Janek either. Just do your job." Elena's muscles tensed at the mention of Janek's name, but she didn't show it. "I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm here to do what I was trained to do." Tomasz studied her for a moment longer, then gave a single nod. "Then keep doing it. And if you need someone to back you up, you know where to find me." With that, he turned and left the gym, leaving Elena standing alone with her thoughts. The next day, the unit was tasked with a series of live-fire exercises at a nearby training range. The drills were designed to simulate a full-scale assault, with GROM operators infiltrating enemy positions, securing critical targets, and providing medical support to the injured. As Elena moved through the exercise, she found herself paired with Janek once again. This time, there was no subtle manipulation, no deliberate attempts to undermine her. Janek's behavior was different. He wasn't friendly, but he wasn't hostile either. His movements were more controlled, more professional. He still didn't like her, but for the moment he was willing to set aside his resentment in order to complete the mission. The exercise was intense, with the unit moving quickly through a dense urban environment, clearing rooms, and taking out simulated targets. Elena stayed focused, her eyes constantly scanning for threats while she moved to treat the wounded operators. As they reached a critical moment in the exercise, Janek was caught in a simulated blast, and Elena quickly moved to stabilize his position, applying a field dressing to his leg. The move was fast, efficient, a textbook response. But as she finished, Janek's gaze shifted to her, his expression unreadable. "Thanks," he muttered, barely loud enough for her to hear. Elena didn't acknowledge the comment. She simply moved on, continuing to perform her role without hesitation. It wasn't until later, during the debriefing, that the real change became apparent. Janek had been quieter than usual, his usual snide remarks absent. And when it came time to discuss the mission, he didn't criticize Elena's performance. Instead, he simply nodded when the team leader commended her for her swift action. It was a small thing, but it was significant. Janek had begun to see her as more than just the outsider, the woman who didn't belong. He was starting to understand that Elena's presence was not a threat to him. It was a necessary part of the team. As the weeks went on, the friction between Elena and Janek gradually faded. There was no grand reconciliation, no heart-to-heart talk. But the quiet animosity that had existed between them was replaced with mutual understanding. Elena had proven herself time and time again, and Janek had come to accept that. There was still a long road ahead for Elena. The unit would continue to test her, push her to her limits, and challenge her in ways she couldn't predict. But as she stood on the edge of the training compound, watching the team prepare for their next mission, Elena knew one thing for certain: she belonged here. She had earned her place, and nothing would ever take that away from her. The following days blurred together as the training exercises continued. Elena had long since stopped thinking of herself as an outsider. She was a part of the team now, and the constant testing and the subtle challenges from her fellow operators no longer fazed her. Every drill, every mission only solidified her place. But that didn't mean the work was easy. Every day was a test, a new challenge, a new way to prove her resilience and ability to adapt. The next big operation was a night exercise that simulated a covert hostage extraction in hostile territory. The mission was complicated, requiring the team to move swiftly and silently, dealing with threats while ensuring the safety of the hostage. It was one of the most difficult simulations the unit had ever undertaken, and it would test not only the operators' skills but their ability to work under extreme pressure. Elena knew the stakes were high. She had trained for this, prepared herself for these kinds of operations, but she wasn't naive enough to think it would be easy. As the team geared up for the mission, she ran through her checklist one more time, ensuring every piece of medical equipment was ready for immediate use. The team leader, Tomasz, briefed the operators, outlining the mission's objectives and expectations. Elena stood to the side, her mind already focused on the task at hand. She wasn't just here as a medic. She was here to provide support, to ensure that the team could move forward with the necessary medical resources, ready to address any casualties. The operation kicked off as planned, and the team moved through the urban environment, making their way to the building where the hostage was being held. Elena was positioned in the middle of the formation, her movements synchronized with the others as they navigated through the dark streets. Her senses were sharp, every sound amplified by the quiet intensity of the mission. They reached the building's entrance, and Elena prepared herself for the chaos that was sure to follow. As the team breached the door, a barrage of simulated gunfire erupted, and the operators quickly took cover. Elena moved with the team, staying low, her focus solely on the task at hand. The hostage was secured quickly, but the real challenge came when they began to extract him. A sudden explosion rocked the building, causing debris to rain down, and one of the operators was injured in the blast. Elena immediately sprang into action, moving swiftly to the injured man's side, applying pressure to the wound while instructing the team to provide cover. The situation was tense. She knew there was no time to waste. As the team fought to maintain control of the perimeter, Elena continued her work, stabilizing the casualty as best she could. She had done this countless times before, but the pressure was higher now. This wasn't a training simulation. This was real. The team made their way to the extraction point, but the path was far from clear. They had to fight their way through the enemy's defenses, using their skills to neutralize any threats while keeping the hostage safe. Elena, though focused on the casualty, couldn't ignore the reality of the mission. She wasn't just a medic. She was an operator, and her role was just as critical as anyone else's. The mission continued, each step a struggle, each second a decision. As they reached the extraction point, Elena felt the weight of the day's events pressing on her. The mission had been successful, but at what cost? The casualty would survive, thanks to her quick action, but there were always risks. The mission wasn't over until every operator was accounted for and every threat neutralized. As the team gathered at the extraction point, the adrenaline of the operation began to subside. The mission had been a success, but there was no room for celebration. The team was exhausted, their bodies aching from the physical strain, their minds still on high alert. Elena felt the weight of the day's events settle into her bones. She had proven herself once again, not just as a medic, but as a member of the team who could be counted on in the most difficult of circumstances. But the cost of that was clear. The mission had been hard, and it had taken everything they had to complete it. As the team debriefed later that night, Elena was quiet, reflecting on the events that had just unfolded. The mission had been a success, but it had been a reminder of just how fragile life was in this line of work. The risks were always there, and the consequences of failure were often dire. Tomasz, as always, was steady in his leadership, guiding the team through the debrief without dwelling on the particulars. But Elena could sense the shift in the way the men looked at her. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. She had earned her place. There were no words of praise, no accolades. Just quiet acknowledgement, the kind that came from having survived, having done your job. As Elena prepared to leave the debriefing room, she caught sight of Yannick across the room. His gaze met hers, and for the first time there was no animosity, no resentment. There was only understanding, a silent recognition that, despite everything, they had both been tested in ways that had pushed them to their limits. The tension between them had finally broken. It wasn't about forgiveness, and it wasn't about winning. It was about the shared experience, the shared understanding that in this line of work everyone had their role, and everyone's role was equally vital. Elena walked out of the debriefing room, her heart still heavy with the weight of the day's events. She knew there would be more challenges ahead. The work was never done, and there was always another mission, another test to face. But for now, she had proven what she needed to prove. She had earned her place, and nothing, no amount of doubt, no amount of animosity, could take that away from her. Days passed, and the tension that had once lingered between Elena and her fellow operators gradually shifted into something else, a mutual respect forged in the heat of shared experiences. The events of the past few weeks had solidified her place among them, and there was no longer any question about her role in the unit. But while Elena had earned the respect of her peers, the cost of that respect was still very much a part of her. She had proven her worth time and time again, but the weight of being constantly scrutinized, constantly tested, had started to wear on her. Every drill, every mission felt like another step in the journey to prove herself all over again. There were no breaks, no reprieves. The work was relentless, and though she had long since grown used to it, there were moments when Elena found herself questioning whether the price was too high. One evening, after a particularly grueling series of training exercises, Elena found herself alone in the mess hall, the sound of the other operators' laughter and conversation fading into the background. She sat at a corner table, quietly eating her meal, her thoughts drifting back to the long days on the training grounds, the missions that had tested her, the relationships that had been forged in the fires of combat. She was exhausted, mentally and physically. But as she sat there, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until Tomasz approached her that Elena realized what had been bothering her. He was one of the few people who truly understood the toll that the constant pressure took on her. He had seen it in the way she carried herself, the subtle signs of fatigue that others overlooked. Tomasz sat down across from her, his face worn from the day's exertions, but his eyes soft with understanding. "You're pushing yourself too hard," he said quietly, his voice gentle but firm. Elena didn't respond at first, her gaze fixed on the tray in front of her. She knew Tomasz was right. She had been pushing herself harder than ever, trying to stay ahead of the game, trying to prove that she belonged. But the cost was starting to catch up with her. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady but lacking conviction. Tomasz didn't buy it. "You're not fine," he said, his voice lowering. "You're carrying a lot more than you should be, and it's starting to show." Elena met his gaze, her eyes tired but resolute. "I can handle it," she said quietly. "I've always been able to handle it." Tomasz studied her for a moment longer before speaking again. "No one expects you to handle everything on your own. You don't have to carry the weight of the world. Not here." Elena didn't say anything, but his words lingered in her mind long after he left the table. The truth was, Tomasz was right. Elena had been shouldering everything herself, trying to keep up with the demands of the job while suppressing the emotional and physical toll it was taking on her. She had always believed that strength meant handling everything on her own, that asking for help was a sign of weakness. But as she sat there, surrounded by the noise of the mess hall, Elena realized that she couldn't keep going like this. She had already proven her worth to the team. Now it was time to prove something else. That true strength wasn't about carrying everything on her own. It was about knowing when to lean on others. The next day, Elena found herself standing at the edge of the training grounds, watching the GROM operators run through their drills. She was preparing for the next phase of the mission, but as she observed them, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. These men, the ones who had once doubted her, now looked to her with a quiet respect. They had seen what she could do, and they knew that she was a vital part of their team. But the weight of that responsibility wasn't lost on her. She knew that her place among them was not guaranteed, that the next challenge, the next test, could come at any time. And yet Elena stood there, watching the team move through the drills, feeling a quiet sense of peace wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to simply be. She didn't have to prove anything anymore. The work, the missions, the battles, they would come when they came. And when they did, she would be ready. But for now, Elena allowed herself to enjoy the moment, to breathe, and to let go of the constant pressure that had defined her life for so long. The mission was always the next step, but for the first time in a long time, Elena realized that there was something equally important, finding peace in the present. It was a quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. The next mission came sooner than expected, a swift, decisive operation to clear a fortified position held by hostile forces. The GROM team was called in, and the familiar buzz of adrenaline filled the air. Elena didn't hesitate. She moved with the team, each step a reminder of everything she had worked for. The mission was intense, but this time there was something different about it. Elena wasn't just there to provide medical support. She was there as part of the team. She was no longer an outsider, no longer someone who had to prove herself with every mission. She was a part of the fabric of the unit, and her strength came not from constantly fighting to be seen, but from knowing she was already seen. The mission was a success, and the team returned to base victorious. There was no grand celebration, no applause, but there was something more important than that. There was a quiet acknowledgement between Elena and her fellow operators that this mission had been just another step in the journey, a journey that, for Elena, had brought her from the margins to the heart of the unit. As she stood in the debriefing room, listening to the team leader's praise, Elena felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't just a medic. She wasn't just a woman in a male-dominated world. She was an operator, a GROM operator, and that was all she had ever wanted to be. The weeks that followed felt like a blur, each day blending into the next with the constant rhythm of training, missions, and the ever-present tension of military life. But for Elena, something had shifted. The pressure that had once consumed her, the need to prove herself, to constantly fight for her place in the unit, had finally lifted. She no longer needed to convince anyone that she belonged. Her actions, her presence, had already spoken louder than any words ever could. Yet, even with this newfound sense of peace, Elena knew that the nature of her work would always carry a weight. It would never be easy. It would never be comfortable. But it was hers, and that made all the difference. One evening, after a particularly exhausting training session, Elena found herself back in her quarters, going through her notes from the day's debriefing. As always, the operation had gone smoothly, but the mental fatigue of the constant readiness had begun to wear on her. The weight of responsibility, the unrelenting demand to be prepared for anything at a moment's notice, was always there, lurking in the background. It was a burden she had accepted long ago, but it didn't make it any easier. There was a knock on the door, and before Elena could respond, it opened slowly. Tomasz stepped in, his expression as calm as always. "I thought I'd find you here," he said with a small smile. Elena didn't return the smile, but she didn't need to. Tomasz was the one person on base who didn't expect her to be perfect. He didn't need to see her perform in order to know what she was capable of. He had seen it all already. "It's been a long day," Elena replied, her voice quiet, almost weary. Tomasz didn't say anything at first. He simply walked over to the small desk in her quarters and sat down across from her. "You've been pushing yourself harder than you need to," he said, after a long pause. "I know you think that's the only way to keep up, but it's not. You're already where you need to be." Elena looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time. "I'm just doing my job," she said softly. Tomasz leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on her. "And you've been doing it well," he said. "But there's more to this than just doing your job. It's about knowing when to rest, knowing when to step back and let others carry the weight." Elena didn't respond. She wasn't sure she agreed with him. For years she had believed that strength meant always moving forward, always pushing harder, always being the one to carry the burden. But now, as she sat there, listening to Tomasz, she felt a flicker of doubt. Could it be that true strength wasn't just about enduring, about never showing weakness? Could it be about knowing when to ask for help? "You don't have to carry everything on your own, Elena," Tomasz continued, his voice gentle but firm. "You're part of a team. And that means sharing the load. Let them help you." Elena sat in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. She had spent so long fighting to prove herself that she had forgotten one of the most important truths of all. Strength came not from isolation, but from connection, from knowing when to rely on others and when to allow them to rely on her. The next day, Elena entered the training compound with a new sense of purpose. She wasn't going to abandon her commitment to excellence, but she was going to approach it differently. She would still push herself, but she would no longer do it at the expense of her own well-being. She would allow herself to rest, to take a step back when necessary, and to lean on her teammates when the burden became too heavy. As she joined the team for the day's drills, Elena felt a sense of calm that had eluded her for so long. The constant pressure, the never-ending race to prove herself, it was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She had learned that the key to true strength wasn't in constantly proving yourself. It was in knowing your limits, knowing when to pause, and knowing when to ask for help. And for the first time in a long time, Elena allowed herself to be vulnerable. The next mission came quickly, a night operation that would require the team to infiltrate enemy territory and extract high-value targets. It was a high-stakes mission, one that would test their abilities under extreme pressure. As always, Elena was prepared, but this time she approached the mission with a different mindset. She wasn't going to carry the weight alone. She wasn't going to fight every battle by herself. She was part of a team, and that meant relying on others when needed. The operation was intense, but this time Elena felt more balanced, more grounded. She moved with the team, providing medical support while also contributing to the tactical operations. When one of the operators was injured during the mission, Elena worked quickly to stabilize him, but she didn't hesitate to call for backup from the others. It wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength. And in that moment, Elena realized that true strength didn't come from being the toughest or the most capable person in the room. It came from knowing when to step up and when to step back. As the team made their way to the extraction point, Elena felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The mission had been a success, and no one had been left behind. They had worked together, each person doing their part, and it had made all the difference. The following day, as they returned to base, Elena found herself reflecting on the journey she had taken. She had started as an outsider, a medic who didn't quite fit in, but over time she had earned her place. not just through her skills, but through her willingness to learn, to adapt, and to understand the value of teamwork. And as she stood in the debriefing room, listening to the team leader praise the mission's success, Elena felt a quiet pride welling up inside her. She had come a long way, but the journey was far from over. The next mission was always waiting, always ready to challenge her in ways she couldn't predict. But now, Elena knew something important. No matter what came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The days after the mission were quieter than usual. Elena found herself in a reflective mood, taking in the steady rhythm of daily life on base. The missions were always fast-paced, always intense, but the moments between them, the moments of routine, had begun to feel more important. She had learned to appreciate them, to find peace in the small, mundane tasks that came with the job. As much as the work itself was taxing, it was the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, that kept her grounded. The quiet moments shared with her fellow operators, the small exchanges of respect and understanding, meant just as much as the victories on the field. Elena walked into the mess hall one afternoon, her mind preoccupied with the latest tactical evaluations, when she noticed something different. The room was abuzz with conversation, but it wasn't the usual banter. There was a certain energy in the air, a kind of anticipation that Elena couldn't quite place. She scanned the room and spotted Tomasz sitting at a table, deep in conversation with a few of the senior operators. Their heads were bent together, their voices low but urgent. Elena raised an eyebrow but didn't approach immediately. She knew that the GROM operators often discussed strategy in their downtime, and it was not unusual for the senior men to gather and discuss the latest developments. But something about the intensity of the conversation made her pause. After a moment, Tomasz looked up and caught her gaze. His expression was serious, his brow furrowed in concentration. Elena felt a flicker of unease. Tomasz gestured for her to join them, and though she hesitated for only a moment, she made her way to the table. As she sat down, the others fell silent, their eyes moving between Elena and Tomasz. "What's going on?" Elena asked, her voice calm but alert. Tomasz spoke first. "We've just received intel on a new operation," he said, his tone measured. "It's a high-priority mission, one that requires a different approach. We'll be moving in to extract a foreign diplomat who's been taken hostage by an extremist group operating in the region." Elena nodded, her training kicking in as she processed the information. "What's the timeline?" she asked. Tomasz leaned forward slightly. "The mission is set for tonight. We have only a few hours to prepare." Elena felt a familiar rush of adrenaline as the details of the mission began to form in her mind. This was the kind of operation she had trained for, the kind of high-risk, high-reward mission that tested every skill she had. The thought of it stirred something deep inside her. This was her chance to prove that she wasn't just a medic. She was an operator, capable of handling anything that came her way. As the briefing continued, Elena listened intently, her mind already running through the various scenarios they might face. She was ready. She always had been. The mission was straightforward in its objective: infiltrate the compound, extract the hostage, and return to base without being detected. But the complexities of real combat never followed a neat, predictable script. Elena knew that there would be variables, unexpected obstacles that could make or break the operation. As the team leader finished outlining the plan, Tomasz turned to Elena. "You're going to be a part of the tactical team," he said. Elena nodded, her resolve firm. Understood. The rest of the team broke into smaller groups to prepare their gear and finalize the mission plan. Elena, as always, ensured her medical supplies were ready, double-checking each item as she meticulously packed them into her tactical vest. There was no room for error, no room for complacency. Every detail had to be perfect. As the sun began to set, the team gathered at the staging point, where they would begin their mission. Elena stood alongside the others, her thoughts quiet but focused. The tension was thick in the air, but she knew how to handle it. The nerves, the uncertainty, it was all part of the job. As the team moved out, Elena stayed close to Tomasz, moving with the fluid precision that had become second nature to her. The operation went smoothly at first. The team infiltrated the compound without being detected, neutralizing any threats with efficiency. Elena worked swiftly, providing medical support as needed while also staying alert for any potential danger. But as they reached the inner perimeter of the compound, things began to shift. An unexpected firefight erupted from a concealed position, throwing the team off balance. Elena's training kicked in as she took cover, moving quickly to ensure the injured operators received immediate attention. The firefight lasted longer than expected, and the team was forced to adapt. Elena could hear the tension in Tomasz's voice as he barked orders, directing the team to secure the area while keeping the hostage safe. Despite the chaos, Elena remained calm, her mind clear as she focused on stabilizing the casualties. The firefight finally died down, but the tension didn't lift. They had secured the hostage, but they weren't out of danger yet. The team made their way to the extraction point, the weight of the mission pressing on them. Elena could feel the strain in her muscles, the exhaustion from the constant vigilance, but she pushed through it. She had learned long ago that this was the price of the work, the price of being part of something bigger than yourself. The extraction was smooth, and the team made it back to base safely. The mission was a success, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that it had been too easy. There had been no major casualties, no surprises that had thrown the operation into chaos. She knew that every mission, no matter how well executed, could change in an instant. As the team debriefed later that night, Elena sat quietly, listening to the team leader's praise. The mission had been a success, but Elena knew there was always more to learn, more to improve upon. She had proven herself once again, but in her mind, it wasn't enough. There would always be another mission, another test. And when that day came, Elena would be ready. In the days that followed the mission, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The success of the operation had been almost too easy, too straightforward. She knew from experience that nothing in this line of work was ever that simple. There was always something lurking beneath the surface, always a variable that could turn everything upside down. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, no matter how well the mission had gone. The team was in good spirits, but Elena found herself reflecting on the quiet moments of the operation, the moments when everything had seemed to slow down, when she had been able to focus on the task at hand without the pressure of external expectations. She had done her job, as she always did, but something had shifted in her understanding of what it meant to truly be part of the team. In the days following the mission, Elena's thoughts turned inward. She had learned to lean on her teammates, to trust them, but the reality of being part of a high-stakes unit like GROM was that there would always be the next mission, the next challenge. And with every mission came the possibility of failure. As she sat alone in her quarters one evening, Elena's mind wandered back to her early days in the unit, the days when she had fought so hard for respect, when she had pushed herself to the breaking point just to prove that she belonged. But now, with the respect of her teammates and her place in the unit secured, she felt something different. She felt the weight of the responsibility that came with being part of something so much bigger than herself. It was a heavy feeling, one that she had never fully understood until now. As she prepared for another round of physical training the next morning, Elena noticed Tomasz waiting for her outside the gym. He was always the steady presence, the one who had quietly supported her from the beginning. Despite his seniority, he had never treated her as anything less than an equal. "You look like you've got something on your mind," Tomasz said as she approached, his voice calm but knowing. Elena didn't immediately respond. She simply stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the question settle. Tomasz had always known when something was bothering her. "I'm fine," she replied, the words automatic but lacking conviction. Tomasz raised an eyebrow but didn't press her further. He simply gestured toward the gym. "Well, I know you're not going to get any answers sitting here. You've got work to do." Elena smiled faintly, the first real smile in days. "You're right," she said, falling into step beside him. As they entered the gym, Elena could feel the familiar sense of focus return. She knew that physical training was where she could clear her mind, where the constant thoughts and doubts could be pushed aside. It wasn't the solution to everything, but it was a start. The training session was intense, as always. The team pushed through rigorous drills, moving through exercises with military precision. But for Elena, it wasn't just about the physical exertion. It was about the mental clarity that came with pushing herself to the limit. By the end of the session, she was tired, but focused, her body aching in all the right ways. As the team wrapped up for the day, Tomasz approached her once more. "You did well," he said, his voice softer this time. Elena nodded, not needing the praise, but appreciating it nonetheless. "Thanks," she replied simply. Tomasz studied her for a moment, then spoke again, his tone serious. "Elena, I know you're still carrying a lot. I've seen it in the way you've been working lately. But remember, you're not alone in this. We're all in this together." Elena didn't respond immediately. She had always carried the weight of responsibility herself, but Tomasz's words lingered in her mind. She knew he was right. The constant pressure, the need to prove herself, it was wearing her down. And yet, despite the exhaustion, Elena knew that she couldn't stop. Not yet. The team was counting on her. She was ready to continue pushing forward, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she didn't have to do it all alone. The mission was always the next step, the next challenge. But for Elena, the real test wasn't in the combat, the strategy, or the tactics. It was in learning to find balance, to recognize when to push and when to step back. She had come a long way from the outsider who had joined the unit with nothing but the desire to prove herself. She had earned her place, but the work was far from over. As the days passed, Elena found herself more at peace with the idea that strength came not from being the best at everything, but from knowing when to lean on others, when to trust in her teammates, and when to take a step back. It was a lesson that would stay with her as she faced the challenges ahead. The road was long and the missions would keep coming, but Elena was no longer running to prove herself. She was running with the team, and together they would face whatever came next. The weeks that followed brought more missions, more challenges, and more moments of reflection. Elena had grown accustomed to the weight of her responsibilities, but there were still days when the burden felt heavier than others. The quiet moments, the pauses between operations, were rare, but they had become important to her. She found herself thinking about her family more often, her parents, her younger brother, and the life she had left behind when she joined the military. Those thoughts, though brief, reminded her why she had made the choices she had. She had joined the military to protect others, to serve a greater purpose, but it had come at a cost. The isolation, the long hours away from home, the endless demands of the job, sometimes it all felt overwhelming. But Elena had learned to keep moving forward. She had learned that the mission was always the next step, and she couldn't afford to stop. The GROM unit continued to push through training, perfecting their techniques and preparing for the next round of operations. Elena's role, though primarily as a medic, had evolved. She was now seen as a leader among her peers, someone who could be relied upon not just for medical expertise, but for her experience in the field. She had earned her place, but the weight of that role was not lost on her. Every day she felt the pressure to be better, to prove that she could continue to rise to the occasion. The next operation came without warning, as they often did. The intel was brief. A hostage situation involving a high-profile target in a remote region. The mission was urgent, requiring the team to infiltrate the area, neutralize any threats, and extract the target. Elena was prepared as always, but there was something different about this mission. The team had worked together countless times before, but this time felt more personal. They weren't just going in to rescue a high-profile target. They were going in to protect lives, to ensure that no one else had to endure the same fate as those who had been taken. As they prepared for the mission, Elena felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, but there was something else beneath it. A sense of duty, of responsibility that transcended the usual rush of combat. The team had been briefed, the strategy had been laid out, and the plan was set. But Elena knew that plans rarely went perfectly. There would be surprises, obstacles, and moments where the team would need to rely on their instincts. The mission began as planned. The team infiltrated the area under cover of darkness, moving swiftly through the rugged terrain. Elena's role, as always, was to provide medical support, ensuring that the team's health and readiness were maintained throughout the operation. But as they reached the compound, things began to change. The enemy was more organized than expected. They had fortified their position, and the team encountered heavier resistance than anticipated. The firefight that followed was intense. The sound of gunfire filled the air as the team pushed forward, neutralizing threats while maintaining a steady focus on the target. Elena moved through the compound with the team, her eyes scanning for any potential casualties. She wasn't just watching for enemies, she was watching for her fellow operators, ready to react at a moment's notice. As the team cleared the building, a sudden explosion rocked the area. The force of the blast threw Elena to the ground, and for a moment she was disoriented. Her vision blurred, and the sound of ringing filled her ears, but she knew better than to panic. She forced herself to focus, to steady her breathing. The explosion had caused chaos, and the team was now scattered. Elena quickly assessed her surroundings, her heart racing but her mind clear. She wasn't injured, but there were others who were. She spotted one of the operators, Tomasz, pinned under debris, his leg trapped. She moved quickly, crawling toward him and using her training to assess the situation. "Tomasz, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. Tomasz groaned, his face pale with pain, but he nodded. Elena worked swiftly, using what little medical equipment she had to stabilize his injuries before attempting to free him from the debris. Her hands moved with the precision that had become second nature to her, but there was a new sense of urgency in her movements. This wasn't just another drill. This was real. As she continued to work, she felt the weight of the mission pressing down on her. She wasn't just treating injuries anymore. She was holding the team together. The pressure to act, to be decisive, was immense. But Elena didn't falter. She knew what had to be done, and she moved with the focus of someone who had already made peace with the cost of the job. The team regrouped, and despite the chaos of the situation, they managed to complete the mission. The hostage was extracted safely, and the enemy position was neutralized. But as they made their way back to base, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that the mission had been too close. The cost had been high. Tomasz had been injured, but he would survive, thanks to Elena's quick actions. The reality of their work, the danger, the constant threat, had never been more apparent. As the team debriefed later that night, Elena sat quietly, reflecting on what had just happened. The mission had been a success, but it had come at a cost. The team had survived, but the weight of the mission, of the lives they had saved and the ones they had lost, lingered in the air. The mission wasn't over yet. The work would continue, and Elena would be ready, as always, to face whatever came next. In the days after the mission, the weight of the experience settled into Elena's bones. She had proven herself once again, but this time it felt different. The mission had been harder than expected, and the risks had been greater than anyone had anticipated. Tomasz, though injured, was recovering, and Elena's swift action had made all the difference. But as she sat in the quiet of her quarters, the adrenaline of the operation slowly fading, she realized that the cost of this life, the constant uncertainty, the moments of fear and loss, was something she would carry with her forever. The team had completed the mission, and they had succeeded, but Elena knew that not every mission would end like this. The weight of the responsibility never truly went away. It followed her into every operation, into every training session, into every moment she spent on base. And yet she had never felt more certain of her place in this world than she did now. The journey had been long, and there had been moments when she had doubted herself, moments when she had questioned whether she truly belonged here. But those doubts had faded. She was no longer just the medic, the outsider. She was part of the team, part of something much bigger than herself. And in that knowledge there was strength. As the days passed, Elena returned to the usual grind of military life. But there was a quiet shift in the air. The respect she had earned from her teammates had only deepened, and there was a new sense of camaraderie between them. The mission had tested them all in ways they hadn't expected, but it had also brought them closer together. Elena wasn't just an operator in their eyes. She was one of them. The bond between the members of the unit was unspoken, but strong. They had all faced the same challenges, the same dangers, and they had survived together. The trust they had built was unshakable, and it was the foundation upon which they would continue to operate. But even as Elena found her place among them, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was always just around the corner. The next mission, the next challenge. It was always waiting, always ready to test her again. And as she stood on the edge of the compound, looking out at the horizon, she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. Elena didn't need to prove herself anymore. She had earned her place, not just in the GROM unit, but in the hearts and minds of those who fought alongside her. And that was enough. As the sun set over the base, Elena took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill her lungs. There was peace in this moment, a rare and fleeting peace that she allowed herself to savor. She had come a long way, but the journey wasn't over. It never would be. The next mission, the next challenge, it was all part of the work she had chosen, the life she had committed to. But for now, Elena was content. She had found her place in this world, and she was ready to face whatever came next. As the last light of the day faded into the night, Elena turned and walked back into the heart of the base, knowing that, no matter what the future held, she was exactly where she needed to be. Jeśli ta historia poruszyła Cię emocjonalnie, zasubskrybuj nasz kanał, podziel się swoją opinią w komentarzach i udostępnij ten film innym.